Okay, so we jumped into this last week. Now, I always go back and I watch our lessons, and sometimes I think I didn't do a very good job on explaining stuff in past lessons. So I'm going to try and just clarify some of the stuff I spoke about last week out of Genesis 2 to help you understand better what the ancients were talking about when they talk about Eden. Now, what is Eden? What? The garden, right. The Garden of Eden or the Garden in Eden. It was one of the things we talked about was it was rather unclear whether Eden was a region or Eden was the name of the garden. Historically, it's been called the Garden of Eden, which doesn't really answer whether or not it was in Eden or whether it was called Eden. Eden is a name that means either well watered or out of that delight. You could translate it as delight more directly, but Eden had four rivers that seemed to stream out of it that we read in Genesis 2. And so the idea of it being well watered seemed like a pretty good way to think about Eden. And out of the well watered garden, you get a bunch of fruit, a bunch of food. And so the idea that it would be a delight would make a lot of sense conceptually. So that made a lot of sense. What I want to do this morning is just clarify some imagery about the way the ancients thought of the God's presence, the divine presence on earth. And I want to start by reading a little bit from this book by Dr. Michael Heiser called The Unseen Realm. This is a very, very good book. It is something that I first read about 2 years ago now, maybe a little less than 2 years ago, while I was on vacation in Colorado, and I pretty much spent 3 days out of my vacation just reading this book. Couldn't put it down. And I'd highly recommend it to any of you, but I'm going to read from this just about a page where he talks about Eden, or the concept of the divine presence and how the ancients would think of the divine presence. Okay, so this is from the Unseen Realm, pages 44 and 45. About the ancient context, Dr. Heiser said this: Eden can only be properly understood in light of the worldview of the biblical writers, which they shared with other people of the ancient Near East. Like Israel, the people of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, for example, also believed in an unseen spiritual world. The divine abode of gods, the place where they lived and where they met for governing the affairs of the human world, were portrayed in several ways. Two of the most common were gardens and mountains. Eden is described as both in the Old Testament. Ancient people thought of the gods in luxurious gardens or mountains for simple reasons. It made sense that gods would have the best lifestyles because, well, they're gods. Cosmic celebrities can't possibly live like we do. Let's just pause there. So the idea that the ancient world was a place where the gods were your celebrity status and everybody knew their names and knew where to find them is a lot like we think of people who are rich and famous these days. They live in the big mansions out in Hollywood or Malibu or wherever. And the mansion style place that they lived were gardens in a sense. We'll talk more about that. All right, picking it back up where I just left off. The ancient Near East was primarily an agrarian society culture. For most people, subsisted day to day, hand to mouth. What does that mean? An agrarian society means they grew their own food, right? They have fields. They plant their own food, they harvest their own food so that they have their own food to eat. They did not have Walmart. What are you guys eating from? Donuts? So you could not go to a donut store and pick up donuts. If you wanted donuts, you had to make your own. And if you wanted the supplies for donuts, you either had to go to a market and hope that somebody had the supplies grown from their fields, or you had to grow your own supplies to make donuts. That's an agrarian society. You grow your own food to eat, subsisting day to day and mouth hand to mouth. So you get to eat whatever you can grow. That's it. The few that didn't live that way were kings or priests, and thinking as the ancients did, those few had been chosen for the elevated status by the gods. The environment was hot and arid. Life depended on finding water and harnessing its power. That's why the world's first civilizations were founded around rivers. Egypt had the Nile, Mesopotamia had the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, surely the gods lived in a place where water was abundant, where life sustaining vegetation and fruit grew everywhere, or an abundance of animals were flourished to fatness. So basically, he's saying you wouldn't expect the cosmic celebrities of the gods to live in a place where they didn't have the best that the land could offer. So they had access to a lot of food and access to enough food not only for themselves but for the animals to get fat enough that they could kill a fattened calf and have a bunch of meat. So the gods get the best, and the best is a garden with access to water and food. The gods lived in places where there was no conceivable lack. In a word, paradise. Mountain peaks were the domain of the gods because no humans lived there. Ancient times were not like modern times. People didn't recreationally climb mountains. They had no equipment with which to get very far if they tried. Mountains were remote and forbidding, the perfect place for the gods to get away from pesky humans. Mountain peaks touched the heavens, which was obviously the domain of the gods. This sort of thinking, in part, explains why Egypt's temples are carved and painted with imagery of luscious gardens and why pyramids and ziggurats were built. Hold on to the idea of ziggurats. You don't even know what they are quite yet. We'll get to that when we get to Genesis 11. These structures were mountains made by human hands, which served as a gateway to the spiritual world, the realm of the gods and life or death. These were metaphors in stone. And then jumping ahead 2 pages to page 47, he just says this: implications of God's planting a garden, then bringing a human into the garden. So this is an implication of Genesis 2, of what he just said about God's planting a garden, having the best, and then bringing a human into the garden, which is what God does in Genesis 2. In fact, let's just read that because I've got that on a slide here. We read this last week. Let's just reread it for the sake of clarity. Back up here. Genesis 2, starting in verse 4, we won't go all the way to verse 17. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created, when Yahweh God made the earth and the heavens. Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up, for Yahweh God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. Then Yahweh God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Now, Yahweh God had planted a garden in the east, in Eden, and there he put the man he had formed. And Yahweh God made all the kinds of trees to grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. And in the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden, and from there it separated into 4 headwaters. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. So basically, the garden is not just a place where there's water, where there's food, and where there's life. There's also all the expensive stuff that you would expect the cosmic celebrities to have. The Pishon River, verse 13, the name of the second river is the Gihon. It winds through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Asher. The fourth river is the Euphrates. And Yahweh God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. And Yahweh God commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will certainly die. Okay. So, getting back to the slides I have for today here. The divine presence on earth is thought of in terms of three primary things that we just talked about. Well, two that we just talked about, and one that I'll add to what Dr. Heiser said here. One is a garden, because obviously a garden is a lush place. It's got lots of life-sustaining water and food. So all of your needs would be met there. You would never lack for food, so you wouldn't be hungry. You would never lack for water, and you would never be thirsty. This is a long way from our typical thinking that says, well, are you hungry? Let's go get food. And you just go get some donuts or go to Walmart and pick up groceries, or you go out to eat at your favorite restaurant. These things didn't exist. But if you had a garden, you likely had access to planting what you wanted, and if it was a good harvest, eating what you wanted. So a garden becomes an image of the divine. And the other one that we talked about is what? Good, a mountain. The remote places that humans don't live and that reach into the heavens where the gods live. So this is supposed to be personifying the divine presence on earth. What reaches up into the heavens where the gods are is a good sign, a good symbol, a good picture of the gods on earth. And then, as he mentioned, you get temples and ziggurats later on. Ziggurats are just a form of a temple, and I'll show you a picture when we get to Genesis 11. But in Genesis 11 and beyond is where we start seeing them show up in Scripture. Temples become the man-made mountain on which mankind attempts to meet with and exert power over the gods, because that's also a part of it. You tried to get the gods to come down to you so that you could control and use a bit of their power, or somehow coerce them to using their power to meet your desired ends. This is what the Tower of Babel actually was, and that's why it's a problem. They were not building a stairway to get themselves to heaven. They were trying to build something to bring the gods down. That was the big problem with it, but we often read that story backwards. More on that when we get there. All right. But there's a third category that Dr. Heiser doesn't go into in this particular spot, but I think is very important. A tree is often thought of in terms of the divine presence because it's part garden, and if it's big enough, it's part mountain. It's part garden because it's got fruit, it's a source of life, it's sustenance, shade from the heat and the aridness of the air. But it's also a mountain because it's unmovable. It's too big to cut down. It's not going to be pushed over by the likes of mere people. That tree was going to outlive you. That tree would probably predate you. It was going to be around for generations. So trees often become a garden mountain motif mixed together. Big, 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 big trees. And the ancient Near East isn't the only place where that was true. So when Genesis 2 is describing God planting a garden, we fail to think of it in ways that the ancient Near Eastern cultures would have thought about it. So consider this garden idea from the ancient Near East. Water didn't come to you through a pipe. Our technological advances cause us to miss entirely what they're implying when they make a simple statement that God planted a garden. We're used to just turning a little faucet and getting water pouring out to us. That didn't exist at the time of the biblical writers. In the New Testament, the Romans had at least created aqueduct systems, but even that was infinitely more limited than just building pipes into your home and you turning a faucet. You had to go out and find where water was, and you had to settle there. So you had to go and search for it, and when you find it, you had to harness its power and make it work for you. So if a place was well watered, that was where you were going to live. And you were never going to go so far beyond that source of water that you had to search for a different source. You were going to stay within a day's walk of that source of water unless you knew there was another source of water 3 days away, in which case you would take enough water to get you from source A to source B. That the closest that I can even think of in modern times in our day and age is has anybody ever gone backpacking? It, it's where you're going to go on like a 5 day trip, let's say, and you're going to take enough food for 5 days, and you're going to go hike out in the wilderness trails or something in Colorado. So I've done backpacking in Colorado for 3 to 5 days at a time and stuff. So you carry a bed, you carry maybe a tent, you carry all sorts of things that you need because you're going to spend your days hiking and then you're going to camp out at night. You're going to stop for food and stuff, but you will look for places to stop next to a river or a stream, sources of water, and you're going to try and make the trip cover enough ground in your trip day to day to get you from one water source to another. It's that kind of idea. So, ancient civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia, Egypt, what river did they have? Good, the Nile. The Nile is 1,000+ miles long. What it does is it goes back and forth like this. And it runs from the north, from the south where it's higher in elevation to the north where it's lower in elevation, and it just goes back and forth like this. And it floods every year. And the soil there, I'll show you pictures of this when we get into Joseph's story in Genesis 11. The soil there is very rich. The problem is there's not a lot of water year round. But every year, if the Nile would flood that rich soil, and crops would spring up for miles on either side. The Roman Empire actually used the Nile and the food that grew there from the flooding every year to feed their entire army at one point in their history, empire-wide. Mesopotamia had the Tigris and the Euphrates, which you already talked about. The land between those two rivers, Mesopotamia means land between two rivers, was lush and fertile, and civilization primarily started there. Israel had the Jordan River flowing straight down the center of it. They had land on both sides of the Jordan that they conquered. So a well-watered place was thought to be close to the gods because it was filled with life. Therefore, it was easy to understand how the ancients would conceptualize a garden to be part of the divine presence in the physical world. So, this is as far as I want to go today, giving you a conception of a garden. And then asking you the question, what is the point of God bringing a person into the garden? What does God want? What is God after when he creates the physical world at all? And why? Oh, why does he choose to give so much responsibility to an image bearer? Because it says here in verse 15, he took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. Why does he give mankind this responsibility? Why in the physical universe are humans given so much more rights and responsibilities than any other creature? And why does God? Yeah, I mean, you're right, because we're image bearers of God. But why does he give us his image? I mean, what is God after when he's doing all of this? When he's doing all of the work in Genesis 1 of creating an ordered universe and pushing back chaos and filling realms with life. What is he doing when he plants a garden and gives humans the responsibility to care for it? These stories in Genesis should start begging these questions for us to answer in some way, shape, or form. What does God want? What is he doing? Because he's God. He doesn't need to do any of this. And this is very, very important to actually understanding the entire story of the Bible. So the question, what does God want, could be answered this way. God wants a family. What if I said it like that? And so he makes himself a family. Not because he's lonely. First off, as we've already seen, the celestial angelic beings already exist. They were there watching when he created order and filled it with life in Genesis 1. Let us make man. And then the us stands there and does nothing while the I am does everything. So he already has a non-physical family. But he's going to create a physical universe and create a physical family. God, one of the ways that you could think about all of this, and Logan mentioned this last week, is that you can conceptualize what God does as he builds himself a kingdom. That language doesn't come up in Genesis 1 and 2, and yet the idea and the image is there perfectly to an ancient Near Eastern mind. The garden would have been God's capital on earth, his home that he lets pesky little humans live in. Because God is a good father and a good king. So God wants what any good king and a good father would want. Children, okay, is just like Geppetto. Geppetto, the good father, created a son, gave him a mouth, and asked the heavens to open the mouth of the child. My wish for the wishing star was that Pinocchio could be a real boy. And so the blue fairy comes down and gives life to the puppet. Well, God wants to extend his family from just the celestial beings that bear his image and are already with him in the non-physical universe to the physical universe where another type of image bearer is meant to join his family and rule his physical world under his authority and on his behalf. I think I've mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. Do you remember me saying who the primary people who ruled a kingdom were? If I was the king, who would primarily administer my kingdom? I would sit and make judgment calls, but when I sit and I say, okay, this is what I want to happen, who would go out and actually do that work? Do you remember? It's been a while since I've said this. It was primarily the king's family, his sons, who would go out and say, okay, our father wants us to grow crops on that field. Well, the king has given us his decree. Now we have to go and actually fulfill that decree. All right, our father wants us to push back this enemy. So we're going to war over here in this place. We've got to figure out how to do that. And typically a good king will let you figure it out for yourselves, and he'll trust his sons and his generals, but his extended family, it wasn't just his sons, his brothers, his uncles, yes, his wives, his daughters, they would in some way, shape, and form find ways to administer the will of that king. And you'll see this in the Bible when you read David's story. Once, even when you read before David with King Saul, Jonathan is the primary person who goes around and does what Saul wants, or at least he's supposed to be, until Saul starts getting in his way, because Saul's not a very good king. But David's a pretty good king. And you'll find that the top people in the kingdom of Israel were David's own family members, were people who were related to David. His uncle was commander of the armies. I forget his name. That's not going to come to me right now. His uncle was primarily in charge of the army for most of his reign. And so you see, king's family were the ones who just administered what the king wants. And when God says, I want a family, God is saying, I want you guys to experience the best that my kingdom has to offer. So live here in my garden. It's God's home. We get to live there. It's God's world. We get to live here. And God says, I actually want you to live here with me, but I also want you to actually do my will as king. And that will is to go out and subdue chaos. We talked about this last week, and we'll pick this up again next week. The whole earth was not Eden. Eden is not the whole world. Eden is a small portion of land located somewhere that can no longer be identified. The picture of paradise in Genesis 2 would have had walls, probably, would have had definite borders, and you're supposed to go out into those chaotic, disordered, unknown places and wrangle it up, turn chaos into disorder and disorder into order, and turn it into Eden. Expanding the borders of Eden is your God-given mandate until Eden was meant to fill the entire planet. And you can start thinking about this in simple terms. Stop living in disorder and chaos when you're meant to be a prince and a princess of God the King. If you're his children, administer his will and turn chaos into order. Clean your rooms. Make your bed. Do your dishes. Fold your laundry. A place for everything and everything in its place is an old phrase for cleaning up and putting things in order. You're meant to do this, and you're meant to live like this because you're children of the King. You're part of God's family. You're meant to have the best. Nick.
Now, I asked this question last week. Are you sure your house is in order?
My house is in order. I am not typically a messy person.
Yeah, show us a picture and then we'll believe you.
All right.
Me too.
I mean, right now, I don't think I have a picture of my room or anything. Well, my camera's back there recording this. Even my storage container is fairly well organized. I mean, it's storage, so it doesn't have to be a place where anything lives, so it's less organized. But my boxes are in one spot, my furniture is typically in another, and there's not a whole lot of overlap. Because if I need to get to one or the other, I had the ability to do it because I thought and planned ahead. Now, you're young and you're immature, and your questions are already designed to say, how do I get out of actually doing this hard work? Because it is hard work. The man can't be lazy in the garden and still fulfill his call to actually work the garden, till it, make more fruit, go out and plant some stuff. Extend the borders of Eden is going to be a lot of hard work, which is why he's not going to be required to do it alone. Who's coming? Eve. It's the very next verse in verse 18 of Genesis 2. It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a suitable or compatible helper for him. And what does he get? He gets a woman. Interesting. And he's got a lot to say about the woman. Adam, not God. Which is interesting because unlike everything today, as soon as Adam sees her, he knows exactly who and what she is, states her purpose, and then they live in peace together in marriage. You have to do the work, but you don't have to do it alone. You have to do the work, but we're here as a group, and we can do a lot of this together. Look, if you will spend the time disciplining yourself and learning discipline and organization, you will save time later on in your life.